Miss Voss, seated behind a modest display of pressed lavender pouches and sugar violets, tied raffia with mechanical grace, her ears far more engaged than her hands. "I always said Venetia had weak nerves," murmured Mrs. Kinnard from the next stall, weighing out gooseberry jam like she was compounding medicine. "Fainted in the garden last week. Nearly crushed the foxgloves." "It wasn't a faint, dear," came the hushed interjection from Mrs. Wildwich, recently armed with a jar of lemon butter and an eagerness to balance purchase with gossip. Lillian called it a melancholy spell, which is genteel for something far less tidy. At that, teacups paused mid-air, the phrase rippling through the marquee like a chill. Melancholy, when uttered by someone like Lillian Reed, didn't mean sadness. It meant scandal tucked beneath a shawl, or regret pressed into a drawer. Miss Voss, silent still, recalled a letter, heavy parchment, foreign stamp passed to Venetia by Lily Archer at the post office just a week prior. "Turin," someone had whispered, and yes, Venetia had gone pale upon receiving it, eyes like open wounds before she'd folded the envelope and said nothing. Grief, after all, came in many envelopes, and yet the mention of Turin lingered now with strange potency, like forgotten perfume blooming in the heat. As whispers bloomed like ivy along the bunting, attention slid sideways off the dead woman and onto the man who had arrived in Elderwood just months prior, Mr. Ezra Quinn. A tall, solemn figure with the kind of face carved by storms, sun-browned, deep-lined, half-haunted. He kept to himself mostly, working the gardens at Rowan House with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to silence. He boarded above the hardware shop, read poetry in the evenings and walked with the slow gait of a man who had once waited too long for a train that never came. "Not local," sniffed Mr. Hulbert, as if that alone implied criminality. "Brought nothing with him but books and a soldier's duffel." "War changes a man," added Mrs. Eves, slicing a Victoria sponge with unsettling exactness, "but it doesn't explain secrets buried in someone else's soil." At that, Miss Voss looked up, her ribbon stilled between fingers, as the breeze tugged at the bunting above, soft, persistent, like a warning not yet fully heard. And in the air between gossip and memory, between a buried locket and a letter from Turin, something darker had begun to stir, something the villagers of Elderwood had not yet named, but Miss Voss had already begun to trace its outline. It was just after the storm had passed, the clouds still sullen and low, when Miss Fenlow trudged up the slick garden path behind the Cray cottage with her shawl tied tight against the wind, hoping only to barter for a few stems of rhubarb for Sunday's crumble, but instead she stopped short at the sight of Miss Althea Cray, slumped unnaturally beside the greenhouse, her back curved like a marionette cut loose, her eyes closed but not at peace, her hands drawn into her chest as though gripping something invisible, and beside her, folded with uncanny care, lay her gardening gloves placed too precisely, too lovingly, for someone who had supposedly collapsed in solitude. Mrs. Fenlow, no stranger to grief, felt something colder than death stir in her chest, and she backed away without screaming, only whispering a single name. "Oh, no, not Althea." The village had always admired and distrusted Althea in equal measure, her quiet intelligence, her solitary nature, the way she remembered everyone's secrets but revealed none of her own, and in much withering, secrets had roots deeper than hedgerows. By afternoon the constable had come, but not before Reverend Briar made a quiet detour to the greenhouse, slipping something from the top shelf into his coat pocket, a small shallow clay dish everyone assumed was filled with nothing but potting grit and rose tags, though Briar had glimpsed a flash of red paper tucked beneath it a week before, something folded, something fragile, and he had the haunted look of a man who knew more than he dared to admit. The villagers, of course, began to murmur, first quietly, then with the kind of rising speculation that always follows when death arrives without warning and leaves no clear cause. Miss Temple, the elderly piano teacher with a fondness for curtain-watching and cherry gin, claimed to have heard voices in the orchard 2 nights before, tense, low, deliberate tones that reminded her of chess players arguing over a final move, and she swore she saw someone pass by in a mustard-coloured scarf, though when pressed, she added, "Or maybe it was just the wind, but the wind doesn't smell like Turkish tobacco now, does it?" Constable Nels found no signs of a struggle, but he did find, buried halfway beneath the overturned compost bin, a silver cross snapped clean in two, its jagged edge glittering like a threat, and when asked, no one could explain how it got there or why it bore, so faint they were nearly missed, the initials AC and TR. The inquest offered no resolution, only the unsettling conclusion of natural causes under unclear circumstances, which satisfied no one, especially not Miss Marlowe, who had known Althea since school days and remembered a time when she signed her letters AC and TR, a pair of initials never spoken of again after the summer of 1942. The silence around Althea's name deepened when, 3 days later, her estranged cousin Julian arrived at the village inn, claiming concern but asking more about her will than her welfare, and when Miss Marlowe saw the fresh scratch along his left cheek, she couldn't help recalling the hawthorn bush behind the greenhouse, its thorns sharp, its branches low, and its silence absolute. That evening, as the sun folded behind the hedgerows and the village settled into uneasy quiet, Miss Marlowe lit a single lamp in her sitting room and pulled a worn box from beneath the floorboards. Inside, wrapped in an old scarf, was a telegram from 1943 bearing the words Thomas Rennick, missing, presumed dead, and a faded photograph of 2 young faces, smiling with the kind of joy that never survives the war, and with a sudden clarity that made her hand tremble. She understood the cross had not been a religious token, but a promise broken, buried, and then unearthed. Not by accident, but by someone who wanted its message to be seen, perhaps even understood. Althea hadn't died of illness. She had died of memory, of secrets that refused to stay buried, and of a visitor who had returned not to mourn, but to finish something long delayed. And as the rain began again, tapping softly against her window, Miss Marlowe whispered a name not spoken in decades. Thomas, and realized the final move in a game neither she nor Althea had chosen to play, was finally fatefully complete. The tea had long gone cold, untouched, as if even the ceremony of civility had withdrawn in the wake of what remained unspoken. The parlour, dim and half-shadowed, smelled faintly of dust and forgotten roses, with something medicinal lingering beneath the lavender polish, a scent that didn't belong to comfort, but to decay masked as order. Clara Willoughby sat stiffly at the edge of the armchair, spine too straight for peace, and when she finally broke the silence, her voice cracked like old parchment. "Camille was never one for ordinary endings," she murmured, her eyes locked on the mantel where a single candlestick stood alone, its twin conspicuously absent, too fond of poetry, riddles, and old superstitions to ever live sensibly. Across from her, Miss Levington stirred her tea with a slow circular motion, though she never lifted the cup, her gaze gliding over the room's peculiar stillness, the drawn curtains that let no light in, the untouched fruit bowl with its waxen gleam, the brittle silence so thick it seemed to press against her ears. She noted Clara's trembling fingers as they brushed the rim of the saucer, pausing mid-movement before composing themselves, as though remembering that they were not alone. She kept to herself after the fire, Clara continued, her words sounding more like a confession rehearsed too often. Said some things couldn't be rebuilt, not homes, not trust, not— There was a pause, not empty, but tight with unasked questions, and from down the hall a grandfather clock chimed past, though Miss Livington knew it hadn't been wound in nearly a month. "And yet she stayed," she said softly, almost to herself, despite the way they looked at her. After the trial, Clara's lips parted as if to speak, then closed, her brow furrowing faintly. She said the truth didn't need to be believed, only remembered, she whispered, like someone reciting something too fragile for daylight. That evening, under the shroud of early mist and the hush of hedgerows heavy with dew, the housemaid Ruby met Miss Livington by the garden wall, fingering the edge of her apron like a child asked to speak before adults. She spoke to herself sometimes in the greenhouse, at dusk, not like she was mad, but like she was reciting something, a rhyme maybe, or a prayer, over and over. Ruby's eyes darted toward the trees, her voice lowering, "And she locked the cellar, ma'am, not with the old brass key, a new one, black, shaped like a crescent." She hesitated, then added, "She told me never to bring lilies into the house, said they, made the dead restless." Miss Livington recognized the look in Ruby's eyes, the quiet dread of someone who had not imagined something strange, but encountered it, tasted it like iron in the mouth. The village said Camille died of cold, that stormy night, found in her library chair with a blanket wrapped too tightly, as though bracing herself, but the hearth was warm, logs crackling, and the window latch broken from within. No one asked about the book open in her lap, filled with Latin phrases, botanical drawings, and pressed marigolds. No one questioned the final entry, scrawled in a rushed, uneven hand. "It waits still, in silence, for me." Days later, Miss Levington walked alone through the garden, and paused beneath the old oak tree, long ago struck by lightning, its trunk hollowed and rotting, and saw the earth beneath it freshly disturbed, despite the gardener Mr. Vale insisting it hadn't been touched in years. She noticed how he worked around that spot obsessively, clipping and pruning with more care than necessary, his eyes flicking toward the ground with unease. "Some roots go deeper than they should," he said cryptically when asked, then turned away and left her standing there as the wind stirred leaves that hadn't yet fallen. That night, the house groaned with its old bones, and Miss Levington sat by the fire, the missing candlestick in her hand, its brass base stained with soot, the wax never quite cleaned, and whispered Camille's name, not as mourning but as a warning. The fire flickered low, and across the room the curtains billowed though every window was locked tight. And in that moment she understood, some tragedies aren't accidents. They are echoes, invitations, rehearsals for something that never truly ended. The desert wind spoke in fractured tongues, dragging heat and memory across the brittle bones of the land, each gust like a forgotten confession clawing its way out of the sand. Captain Ellery Graham rarely spoke of his years beyond the Aljaloon Ridge, where soldiers learned to bury their sanity before they're dead, yet on a faded spring evening, over a half-drunk cup of oversteeped Darjeeling, he had leaned toward Inspector Darrow and murmured, "Some ghosts wear boots, and they don't haunt, they march." No one knew quite what he meant, but his eyes had flicked toward the western horizon, where the sky bled red into the land like an old wound refusing to close. Weeks later, after the unexpected inheritance of Halverton House, a long-abandoned estate veiled in ivy and rumour, Miss Adela Finch, local historian and reluctant clairvoyant, was asked to oversee its contents. The will had arrived anonymously, stipulating several oddities. The east garden was not to be disturbed, the cellar door was to remain locked until equinox, and most peculiarly, the attic trunks were to be opened in the presence of a witness who bears no bloodline nor bone memory. The phrasing alone sent a shiver down her spine. The house itself was like a breath held too long, dust thick with time, the kind that coated your soul, not just your shoes, paint peeled from walls as though the house itself were trying to forget its own insides. In the library, volumes were still stacked around a cold fireplace, but one, an herbal compendium, had fresh prints in its dust. In the cellar, the scratch marks across the stone steps weren't recent, but they were deliberate, deep, desperate, and uneven, as though something had been dragged down not willingly. The groundskeeper, Colin Phelps, a man whose hands trembled when asked about the east garden, admitted that some nights he heard the old phonograph playing though no electricity had run to the house in years. He swore he once found damp, barefoot prints around the player, small like a woman's, and once the unmistakable sound of whispering behind the library walls when no one else was in the house. Upstairs, beneath the floorboards of the attic, Miss Finch discovered a time-worn trunk, its nameplate scratched and nearly lost to corrosion, a Thorn, 1916. Inside, a child's gloves, a rusted letter opener, an officer's button engraved with a lion rampant, eerily identical to the crest she'd once seen on a forgotten stone in Ridley Chapel, where no official record listed a burial. Her hands shook as she pulled free a water-damaged journal tucked beneath the lining, its contents bizarre and rhythmic, entries dated by moon phases, scrawled with frantic notes and one recurring sentence etched repeatedly in the margins. The soil remembers what the tongue forgets. That night, Miss Finch dreamed of a woman standing silent at the foot of her bed, in a moss-clad military coat, her face half-shadowed, lips unmoving, yet her voice entered Finch's mind as clear as bells. "He broke the seal. I stayed to hold it closed." When she woke, the mirror above her dressing table was fogged over from within, and the final chapter of the book she'd been reading had vanished. Inspector Darrow, now fully alarmed, uncovered old war records. Captain Graham had been reported missing after a collapse near a cryptic burial site, found days later, half delirious, reciting words in a dead language no one recognized. When questioned about Amelia Thorne, his one-time companion and field nurse, he'd gone pale and whispered, "She took the lock, I held the key." With that they broke the seal on the forbidden cellar, revealing behind the wine racks a bricked alcove far newer than the rest. Hidden in the hollow was a metal child's toy chest, oddly pristine, its contents grim, 2 adult femurs and a smaller set of bones wrapped in tattered silk, the fabric stained with what looked like old ink but smelled faintly metallic. Sprouting near the base of the bricks was a sprig of rue, green and impossibly fresh despite the lack of sunlight. Miss Finch, shaken but steady, kept the officer's button in her coat pocket as she stood in the east garden at dusk, her breath catching when she saw beneath the struck sycamore tree a faint circle of burnt earth as though something had once emerged or been sealed there. That evening, alone in the house as night pressed its ear against the windows, she whispered Amelia's name, not in fear or reverence but in warning, and in reply the wind stirred the curtains though every latch remained locked, the phonograph turned without touch, and the lion-crested button in her palm grew warm. Not every disappearance was a loss. Some were bargains. Deliberate, sacred exchanges made to hold something far worse at bay. And now, with the house no longer empty, Miss Finch understood. Whatever had been buried wasn't just forgotten. It had been fed silence, fed secrecy, and like all things buried too long, it was beginning to stir. It began not with a scream, nor a shadow flitting past candlelight, but with something far more insidious, a pressed violet, impossibly preserved, discovered between the brittle pages of the 1912 parish almanac, precisely behind a baptism entry that had no corresponding parish record, an event neither confirmed nor denied by history, simply suspended, like dust in a room no one dares to enter. Mrs. Clarimond Price, a quiet but perceptive woman with a fondness for silence and archives, was sorting through the forgotten shelves of St. Bryony's vestry when her fingertips brushed against the delicate petals, still soft, inexplicably fragrant, as if they had not been dead for over a century. Folded beside it was a thin sheet of time-worn paper, its corners curled, its ink faint but deliberate, bearing just 3 words in spidery copperplate. Return what was kept. The air shifted around her then, a cold breath pushing down from the rafters, unsettling the candle flames and her pulse. She tried to dismiss it as coincidence, yet that night as she locked the vestry doors, she glimpsed something, a figure perhaps or a trick of dusk, standing motionless at the edge of the rectory garden, beneath the long-dead hemlock tree, where no one had walked in years. The next morning brought more strangeness. Reverend Mallory reported that someone had turned the soil beneath the hemlock during the night, though no tools or footprints remained, only a folded handkerchief monogrammed with the initials ELH, and a small child's bell rusted shut. When asked about Elise Halbert, the Reverend grew still. Elise had vanished in 1912, last seen lighting the altar candles at Vespers. The official version said she drowned, but no body was found, just a blue ribbon floating by the reeds, and a coffin buried with stones in place of bones. Villagers whispered that her disappearance coincided with the abrupt closure of Langdon House, once home to the Halbert family, whose name had since been swallowed by silence and ivy. Clarimonde, increasingly unsettled, visited the parish solicitor, Mr. Drenley, a man with a memory like dry parchment, and inquired about Elise's death certificate. He frowned, thumbed through brittle ledgers and confessed, "There isn't one." Around the same time Miss Fennique, elderly, near blind but sharp in the places that matter, muttered, "Langdon House is listening again," before returning to her tea. Within days other oddities emerged. Mirrors in the vicarage cracked down the centre without cause, clocks stopped at precisely 3:17 a.m., a parishioner's infant was found giggling at the window, waving to no one, and Clarimonde herself awoke one dawn with dirt under her fingernails and her slippers wet with dew. The town postmistress Mrs. Ellery quietly admitted receiving a postcard from Turin blank save for a child's rattle photographed in sepia, with the caption, "She remembers." That same afternoon, a parcel appeared on Clarimonde's doorstep, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, containing only a single child-sized glove, hand-stitched, lined in blue satin, stiff with something that looked like dried ink or blood. The silence around Elise was no longer passive, it was pressing, active, almost breathing. Clarimonde searched the church anew and finally found Elise's diary, not locked away but hidden in plain sight, wedged behind the Book of Common Prayer, as though grief had been buried not in earth but in scripture. The entries began with joy, simple notes about candles, hymns and a Captain M, whose name never appeared in parish rosters, but over time the writing frayed, became nervous, urgent and finally terrified. The last entry read, "He promised to come for me before the frost. The frost has come, he hasn't." That same night, Clarimonde dreamt she stood once again in the vestry, but the walls were dripping, the candles burned blue, and every pew behind her was filled with the villagers, past and present, dirt streaked across their faces, all staring at her, unmoving, expectant. The next morning, the front door of Langdon House, locked since 1938, was ajar, and on the porch sat a child's toy horse, newly painted, rocking gently in the windless dawn. Elise had not gone quietly. She had been hidden, folded into the parish's memory, like an unspoken sin, buried not in mercy but in fear. Now, whatever pact had kept her silent was crumbling, and Clarimonde understood the terrible truth. Some griefs are not buried, they are stored, preserved, and they remember who left them behind. Like a needle slipping into fabric worn soft by grief and time, the evening folded itself around Weatherly with an unsettling quiet, the kind that didn't hush sound but swallowed it whole. Shadows clung to the hedgerows, stretching longer than the light that birthed them, while the last cries of jackdaws dissolved into the grey hush that always preceded something unspoken. Miss Evelyn Hargrave, a woman whose silence spoke volumes, sat in the drawing-room of Eastmere Lodge, the oldest house on the hill, its bricks held together more by memory than mortar. Her fingers moved rhythmically across the worn wool of her knitting, but her eyes, sharp as pins, remained fixed on the window overlooking the garden path. It was the same path once walked every evening at precisely 7 by Captain Lionel Ashcroft before he disappeared without warning, without farewell, without even a shadow to chase. Officially, he was declared missing in action, presumed dead. Unofficially, the village believed something far stranger, for the night he vanished, the bells of the old chapel rang 3 times at midnight, and the next morning, his wife's wedding portrait had fallen from the wall, glass cracked neatly down the middle. That legacy of silence had haunted the lodge ever since, and Miss Hargrave had never quite believed it was coincidence. The house still smelled faintly of salt, old tobacco and sandalwood cologne, the scent of a man who some claimed had never truly left. Down the lane, as dusk deepened into a velvety twilight, Clara Winslow, 23, bright-eyed, unshaken by tales of ghosts or missing soldiers, made her way from the bakery, her basket swinging lightly at her elbow. She carried nothing of value, a half-pound of toffee, a loaf of rye, and a single letter sealed in unusual blue wax, a letter she'd been asked to post anonymously that very evening. Clara had no reason to feel fear. Weatherly was not a place where one locked doors before dark or glanced over their shoulder at passing shadows, but as she passed the old Ashcroft wall, overgrown with ivy and trembling clematis, she felt it, the shift. The air turned too still. The hedge rustled not from wind but with intent. Before she could cry out, a figure lunged, not toward her but for her basket. Rough gloved hand snatched it, and she stumbled backward, striking her shoulder against the cold iron gate. No words, no face, just the fading beat of footsteps swallowed by the earth. By the time Miss Hargrave reached her, alerted by the sound of the gate creaking too long, Clara's shawl was torn, and her voice trembled with something that sat deeper than fear. Confusion, violation, disbelief. Hours later, the basket was found behind the chapel vestry, its contents scattered in disarray. Everything was still there, the bread, the sweets, everything but the letter. It had vanished. And Miss Hargrave, though comforting Clara with gentle hands and hot tea, already felt the narrative drawing itself into place. This wasn't theft. Not here, not in a village where currency was trust, and crimes were often coated in civility. This was something else, a surgical retrieval, swift and silent. The kind of act carried out not for gain, but to erase. By morning, the whispers had taken shape. At the grocer's counter, Miss Audley, always 2 steps ahead of a fact, leaned in close over a bundle of carrots and whispered, "They say he was seen near the chapel hedge again." Mr. Hill, polishing his butcher's knives with too much focus, added in his gravelly tone, "Same tall coat, same slow walk, 5 minutes before the girl screamed." They all meant the same person, Mr. Bryce, a reclusive man with tired eyes and a gait too straight for his age, who'd come to Weatherly just 6 months ago and rented the gamekeeper's cottage on the edge of the Ashcroft estate. When asked where he came from, he only said, "Nowhere you'd know." That morning he had no alibi. He had been walking, he admitted, to clear the mind, though his voice carried the weight of things unspoken. Miss Hargrave found him near the graveyard, where the fog still clung low to the stones. His eyes were dull but honest. "I'd never harm a soul," he said softly. "I've fought in places where pain was traded like coins. I wouldn't bring it here." Miss Hargrave regarded him a long moment, then replied, "No, but sometimes what we carry arrives before we do." He said nothing more, only blinked slowly as if the thought had never occurred. But the most troubling clue lay ahead. At the registrar's office in Brackhampton, Miss Hargrave inquired politely, as one might about a lilac bush or an old family clock, into the last known will of Mrs. Isadora Ashcroft, the captain's widow. The solicitor, a thin man with transparent glasses and a talent for discretion, revealed a curious fact. A revision had been made mere days before her death. The original will had left the estate to her sister, but the revision named a new heir, simply Langford. No first name, no address, no explanation. The document had never been signed. She said it was long overdue, the solicitor remarked, but she died before she could make it final. The previous will remained in force, legally untouchable. Yet Miss Hargrave felt the tremor of something deeper than law. Why would a woman nearing the end of her days risk changing a will for someone untraceable, unless that person was neither stranger nor dead? That night the village felt colder, though no frost had come. The clocks in 3 houses stopped at precisely 11:08. A child sleepwalked to the chapel gate, and claimed she heard music from the loft, though the door was locked tight. And Miss Hargrave, alone in her parlour, lit a final lamp and opened the war diary of her late uncle, a man who had once served with Captain Ashcroft. On its final page, dated in shaky ink just weeks before his own passing, were the words, "He never left. He only changed his name." And then, as if summoned by that sentence, came a knock at the door, 3 soft, deliberate raps. Miss Hargrave opened it slowly, but there was no one there, only the scent of sandalwood curling in the air, and on the doorstep, a single brown glove damp with river water, its lining stitched with the initials, T.A. As she stepped through the veiled hush of the cobbled market square, where time seemed to cling to the lamplight like ivy to stone, it was not guilt but a strange and resolute calm that settled over Elsinora Val. She had not taken what was not hers, she had reclaimed it, not as a thief desperate for possession, but as a widow demanding silence from the past that had once refused to speak. The locket she now wore, warm against her skin beneath her shawl, had always been more than just keepsake or ornament. It was testimony, proof etched in metal and memory, and that proof had unraveled a lie woven into the very fabric of an inheritance thought sealed long ago. That Saturday's church fair should have brought cheer, but a curtain of heavy clouds dulled the stalls, the rain-washed bunting sagging like tired flags of a forgotten war. Yet beneath a faded canvas awning, amid old bric-a-brac and borrowed cheer, Miss Eloise Marlin moved with deliberate quiet to the book table, where discarded volumes waited like orphans, sermons, romances, outdated almanacs, and paused at a battered cloth-bound book of fables, its spine flaking with age. Inside, between the pages marked by the cracked bell's warning, she found not paper, but past, a sepia-toned photograph, soft at the edges and water-stained, depicting a young woman, Araminta Blake, no doubt in her early 20s by the cut of her coat, standing beside a girl holding an infant, the expressions caught between affection and fear. No names on the back, no inscription, only the haunting clarity of a secret not meant for eyes. Miss Marlin tucked it gently into her handbag, her pulse steady, but her thoughts unraveling. The child in that image, the one once declared stillborn according to parish records, had clearly lived, and the eyes of the young girl holding him bore an uncanny resemblance to someone now grown and walking quietly among them. That photograph hadn't been lost, it had been discarded, hidden, like an unwanted confession left beneath a collapsing roof. Later that afternoon, under the guise of polite inquiry and aided by a borrowed letter from the bishop's secretary, Miss Marlin gained entrance to the Brackenshire Public Records Office, where ironwork gates guarded truths and the scent of damp paper lingered like a hush. "I've always believed," she said to the hesitant clerk, "that midwives often record what vicars choose to forget." Led through oak corridors to the 1919 logbooks, her finger stopped on an entry too quickly buried: Langford, male, stillborn, mother, A.B., father, but below it, almost as an afterthought, pinned within a folded medical log, was a second note, handwritten in haste by a nurse whose name had since faded from public memory: delivered healthy male child to Miss A.B., 6 blems, no complications, confidential request to conceal, 2 births recorded in one breath, one public, one erased, and between them, a silence that had stretched over decades, worn thin but never broken. That evening beneath the greenhouse shadows, Miss Marlin found Mr. Fenwick, formerly of London, now of no fixed origin, tidying the rake handles with an air of practiced detachment. He turned as she approached, and before she could speak, he said, "She never named him, my mother I mean, only told me he was a soldier who vanished, that she gave me the name Langford, not from a man, but from a locket, said it was his, I still have it, silver. I used to wonder if he ever knew I existed, if maybe he was looking." His voice didn't shake, but something behind it fractured quietly. "I came here because of that name. It kept surfacing in her journals, her stories, like a thread that never led anywhere, until now." Miss Marlin nodded once, slowly, because she too had followed that thread, through photographs hidden in children's books, through falsified ledgers and whispers left under stone, and now, standing before her, unknowingly, was the heir to a house that had pretended he never lived. And somewhere in that soil, truth had begun to bloom again, not loud, not violent, but certain, the kind of truth that, once unearthed, could never be buried again. As the afternoon shadows stretched long across the worn flagstones of Bramblehurst Lane, Miss Ethel Cartwright returned not with the gait of triumph, but with the quiet gravity of someone who has exhumed more than just history, something buried, something volatile. The village had expected her to vanish into the folds of forgettability after her brother's sudden passing and the ambiguous codicil in his will that had left the once unquestioned inheritance suspended like a question mark. But Ethel had returned not as a claimant nor as a mourner, but as one who knew that truth, when left alone too long, begins to ferment. It was during the annual spring reading fair held beneath skies grey as old slate and bunting limp with drizzle that something shifted. While others crowded near hot cider and second-hand shawls, Ethel lingered beside the antiquarian bookstall, where she found pressed flat inside a hymnal beside the hymn "Abide with Me," a yellowing envelope marked only with the symbol of a sparrow and sealed in wax. Inside, a single page, a letter, unsigned but intimate in tone, written in a looping hand she had not seen since girlhood. It referenced the attic room in Hollybriar House and something hidden beneath the floorboards sealed in cedar away from the frost. That evening, after polite company had scattered and the lamplighters had finished their rounds, Ethel climbed the attic steps alone. She remembered the cedar box well, a wedding gift never used, and beneath it the wood gave way to a cavity barely wide enough to conceal a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. But it was no financial record. It contained sketches, charcoal renderings of a woman's face, repeating, altering with subtle anguish on each page. And beneath the drawings, a lock of dark hair wrapped in silk, and a document, a marriage certificate. Ethel's brother, Leonard Cartwright, had not only married in secret during the war, but fathered a child he never acknowledged. The mother was someone known to them all, Jane Selwyn, who had worked as a nurse at the infirmary and vanished after Leonard returned from France in 1919. No public record of the child's birth existed, only this private testament, one Leonard had clearly intended to make right, had begun to make right, until something or someone stopped him. Days later, Ethel stood at the gate of Blackthorn Cottage, where Jane's sister, Miriam, still lived in solitude. There, amid overgrown lilacs and the sound of an old clock ticking away in a dim hallway, Ethel found the rest of the story. The child, a boy named Nathaniel, had grown up believing himself orphaned, sent to a boys' school under a different name, unaware of his true lineage. Miriam had kept his mother's memory intact through letters she never mailed and portraits she never hung. Leonard tried, Miriam whispered, voice a ghost's exhale. But his mother, Eleanor, would rather erase blood than share it. That name struck a familiar ache. Eleanor Cartwright, the matriarch with a mouth like a scythe and a legacy she guarded like a fortress. Back at the manor, Ethel confronted Eleanor not with fury, but with a quiet recital of truths now beyond her control. You buried a boy, not in ground but in forgetting, she said. But forgetting doesn't keep the roots from growing. Eleanor said nothing, only placed a trembling hand upon the edge of the hearth, eyes dry but brittle. I did what I thought necessary, she murmured at last, for the name, for the house. Love makes fools of us, but shame turns us to stone. Ethel did not reply. She simply placed the marriage certificate and the boy's lock of hair atop the piano where Leonard had once played. That spring, the manor's garden bloomed in odd, unfamiliar patterns, rose bushes unfurling where brambles once stood, tulips tangled in places no bulbs had been planted. Miss Ethel Cartwright, with her sharp memory and steadier heart, arranged a quiet luncheon. She invited Reverend Thorne, whose sermons had always left room for human error, Miriam Selwyn, who had borne decades of silence, and a young man named Nathaniel, who had arrived in Bramblehurst to teach history at the village school, unaware of the blood in his veins or the soil that remembered him better than the living. They gathered without drama, without confrontation. Over tea, Ethel returned the lock of hair to its rightful heir. Some inheritances, she said gently, aren't measured in land or ledger but in courage, the courage to claim what was never given aloud. And though no toasts were made and no signatures exchanged, a legacy was restored, not through legality, but by something deeper. The manor's bell, long disused, rang that evening, not as a summons but as a benediction, as if the house itself had remembered something precious that had once been lost and now finally could rest. The rain had stopped at Blackthorn House, but its footsteps still echoed like a widow's veil drawn tight across the estate, soft and clinging, wrapping every stone and wooden beam in the remnants of mourning. A pale, hesitant light filtered through the slits of old wooden doors, creeping in, as if fearful that it might awaken a face long buried, a memory too fragile to confront. Meredith Harrow had not come seeking ghosts, only meaning answers buried within the cryptic pages of her late mother's diary. But as she stood in the damp, near-silent cellar, her lantern casting flickering shadows across the stone, she felt the weight of time breathing down her neck. Some secrets do not die with the years, they hibernate, tucked inside forgotten letters, sealed behind bricked-over walls, or sleeping in the dust of a family's silence. Her fingers, trembling slightly, traced the uneven brickwork at the back of the cellar, until one brick, loose and unassuming, shifted beneath her touch. Behind it, a small cavity revealed itself like a wound reluctantly reopening. Inside, wrapped in decaying velvet, was a wooden box swollen with moisture, its seams buckled with time, but its contents heartbreakingly preserved. She opened it, and the past spilled into the present like smoke. Inside lay a raven-shaped brooch, one of its dark stones missing, as if plucked by regret itself, a bundle of sepia-toned photographs curled with age, and a single violet flower, dried and crushed, yet still stubbornly intact. Beneath it all, an envelope yellowed, unsent, and unnamed, carried only 7 handwritten words, for the one who watched but never spoke. That night, beneath the creaking ceiling of Blackthorn's drawing room, with rain starting again like a whisper of the past remembering itself, Meredith opened the letter. Its words did not merely speak, they screamed, quietly and unbearably, through decades of buried guilt. It dated back to 1943, a time of war, when Elspeth Harrow, Meredith's grandmother, fell in love with a man the world would never forgive, a German soldier stationed nearby under secret arrangements. The love, doomed from the beginning, was brief and blinding. One night she vanished, no note, no goodbyes, no witness. The village buried her name in whispers, calling it shame, madness, desertion, but the letter told a different story. Someone had seen her that night, drenched and trembling beneath the shattered greenhouse roof, her shadow trembling between duty and desire. And someone had returned home in her place, silent, shivering, and forever altered. The letter's final lines chilled Meredith to her marrow. I was afraid. Of truth. Of a love that demanded courage. I never had. That single confession changed everything. The walls of Blackthorn were no longer just walls. They were listeners. Keepers. Guardians of a sorrow that had waited far too long to be acknowledged. Meredith rose. The letter clutched in her hand like a pulse, and lit the fireplace not for warmth but for rebellion. The silence that had ruled this house for generations was finally cracking. She placed the raven brooch and the violet flower gently upon the mantel like offerings at an altar, and rearranged the house's portraits. Elspeth's rigid sister, long regarded as the matron of the house, was sent to the attic, and in her place a forgotten photograph. Elspeth, smiling, arm in arm with a man whose name history had tried to erase, now stood above the piano. where music could find her again. Meredith said nothing to anyone, but in the days that followed, she walked the halls with the heaviness of someone carrying borrowed sorrow. Everything she touched shifted, slightly, but meaningfully. The air in Blackthorn House grew different, not lighter, but honest. One afternoon, while volunteering at the nearby church, she stumbled upon another letter tucked inside a donated Bible, one that unmistakably bore Elspeth's handwriting. It was brief, bare, devastating. To the one I never dared call mine. It was a love that had no name, no photograph, no ending, and yet it had survived, folded in guilt, pressed in silence, and now trembling in Meredith's hands. Some secrets, she realized, do not seek punishment, only recognition. Some truths do not demand justice, they only ask to be heard. And sometimes healing does not come through answers, but through remembering what others tried to forget. The story hadn't ended in 1943, it had simply gone underground, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the light. The morning fog curled around the skeletal trees of Ashgrove Hollow like forgotten breath, clinging to every crevice of stone and branch, as if reluctant to let go of the past it had hidden for so long. There was a stillness in the air, not of peace but of anticipation, like the pause before a confession beneath the pale hush of the sky. Sylvia Wren stood motionless near the shattered greenhouse, a rusted lantern flickering in one hand, the other clutching a weather-stained journal and a brass key whose teeth were jagged with time. The journal, bound in cracked leather and filled with her grandmother's looping script, had led her here not with directions but riddles, verses scrawled in desperation. Where orchids bleed and shadows know your name, truth waits beneath the roots. No one in the family spoke of Estelle Wren, not since the day she vanished in 1954, abandoning a prominent social life, her estate, and every trace of herself as if she'd been swallowed whole by the ground. Whispers said she'd run mad or worse, but Sylvia had never believed in madness without reason. What she found beneath the orchids wasn't madness, it was memory. Hidden beneath a bed of twisted vines and broken flower pots was a trapdoor, warped with rot, its bolts reluctant, as though the darkness below had grown possessive. The staircase wound downward in brittle spirals, the air shifting from damp earth to something metallic, the scent of rusted time and old breath. The corridor below was lined with relics, each item preserved with reverence and pain: a child's boot, a silver spoon with initials worn smooth, a music box that played half a lullaby before falling silent. At the end stood a glass front cabinet, etched with the words "For the one who asks." Inside, wrapped in velvet the color of dried blood, was a gold serpent ring, coiled endlessly around itself, and an envelope bearing a name Sylvia had never heard, her own mother's middle name, and a letter that opened with, "To the daughter I never held." Estelle's confession unraveled in trembling ink, a secret affair with a man revered in town, a pregnancy hidden, and a betrayal so deep it had forced her to choose exile over shame. "I disappeared," she wrote, "not to escape life but to protect a child from it." Sylvia's hand shook as she read the words, a truth blooming in her chest, both sweet and suffocating. She wasn't just a granddaughter uncovering her family's past, she was the final page of a chapter never written. That night she lit the long-dead hearth in the parlor for the first time in nearly 70 years, not for warmth but for reckoning. Each room she restored in the days that followed became an altar to forgotten names and silenced voices. She spoke aloud to portraits that had watched in silence, played the broken lullaby again and again until it no longer felt eerie but tender. And when she found the recorder hidden behind a false panel in the attic, its reel dusty but intact, she heard a man's voice, broken and brittle with age, whispering through static. "I failed her. I loved her, but I was a coward," and in those few words she felt the gravity of what had truly been lost, not just love but the courage to claim it. There was no grand revelation to share, no newspaper headlines, no trials, only quiet restoration. Justice had not come as a blade but as a balm. The truth had been buried not in malice but in fear, and now it breathed again, not with fury but forgiveness. The estate didn't feel haunted anymore, only honest, and as primroses bloomed brighter than ever before beside the greenhouse ruins, Sylvia finally understood. Some stories don't end with thunder but with a whisper that someone finally heard. And now we turn to you. If you unearthed a family truth long buried to protect legacy and reputation, would you leave it untouched to honor the silence, or reveal it and risk changing how the world remembered them? Would you choose the safety of forgetting or the power of knowing? Let us know in the comments. Your thoughts, your heartbreaks, your answers. Because sometimes the deepest mysteries aren't solved with clues but with courage, and not all endings allowed. Some bloom slowly in the quiet light of understanding.